Hello everyone, and today I'll be talking about the loop types in programming. Now, loops allow us to repeat a block of code over and over again based on the situation and our need. Unity Engine uses C Sharp, which has four types of loop: for loop, while loop, do while loop, and for each loop. I'll explain each of them in this video. We will be starting off with a while loop. First, I declared an integer assigning to it 0, and here's our while loop. We simply use the while keyword, we put our condition here, and then here is our block of code. If our condition is true, then execute this block of code. If not, then it will simply not execute. Now remember, this is a loop. So as long as our condition is true, that block of code will be repeated to a level where our condition will be false. Now allow me to show you and we will test this out. Well, there you go. As you can see, a loop has been happened, and here we got from 0 to 4. Now what simply happened here is we have our integer that has 0 in it. We check if this integer is lower than 5, and we debug.log to track what's happening in our code. Then we increment our integer by 1. And that's simply what happened, and our loop worked perfectly. Now this is the while loop. Let me show you the do while loop. Here, as you can see, this is our do while loop. Now there's a small difference here. This is our block of code, and here our while condition. Now what's happening here, that the do while will execute once at least. So I'm going to do something here. We're going to assign 5 into our integer. What's gonna happen here is we do this block of code, it will be executed, then it will check if this condition is actually true. It will execute only once, then it will check the condition. Allow me to show you. As you can see, the block of code has been executed once, and this is the difference between do while and while. The do while, whether the condition is true or false, it will be executed once at least. The while, the code will never execute it as long as the condition is false. But let's stress it out again. And yep, as you can see, our loop has been run successfully. Now what's happened here is the block of code has been executed, then the condition is being checked. As long as true, execute again. Now let's go into the for loop. Now the for loop works a little differently from while and do while. As you can see, we can assign a variable inside the for loop. Then we check the condition to execute the block of code or not. And in the third stage, what's gonna happen after the loop is being done. So as you can see, we assigned an I equals 0, then check if I smaller than test loop. After that, increment I. We're going to assign 5 to test loop. That means that the for loop will run at least 5 times. As you can see, here is our loop. It worked perfect. Now, as I said, you can actually define a variables in this section of the loop. You can actually define multiple ones, not necessarily an integer, it could be float. And this will be condition of if this loop is gonna be execute that block of code or not, meaning if I actually not smaller than this loop, then the block of code will not be executed. Then here what will happen after the loop is done. When you end this block of code, do this, and in our case it's increment I. This is as simple as that. This is the for loop. Now we're going to go to the for each loop. Now to use the for each loop, I would need a list or an array. I'll be using an array now. Now usually we use for each loop to scan an array and a list and get the element in it. I made the test string array, and it has a 5 arrays: AA, BB, CC, DD, and EE. Now for each string in this array, which is test, we're going to execute a block of code. Now what's going to happen, we're going to track what's happening in our loop. Yep, and here we are. The for each has been successfully done. Therefore, it shows a log of each element in our array. Now you can do that in a variety of way. Depend on a list on an array, you can execute more a block of code. Same as I can increment the test loop. Yep, as you can see, it actually works again. From 0 to 4, and it copies all our strings. Now a very important thing that you need to know about is the keywords. Loops have two keywords, which are continue and break. Break will simply break you out of the loop. Allow me to explain. Now simply what's going to happen, then if test loop equals 1, then break out of the loop. The loop will stop executing as long as this condition is true. Allow me to show you. As you can see, the loop has not been fully completed because, as we know, our array consists of 5 elements, but since the test loop is actually equal 1, we break out of the loop. Now allow me to give you an example of the continue keyword. Now the continue keyword will actually skip the rest of the block of code and will continue to the next element. I'm going to give you an example here. So we actually increment test loop by 1. If test loop equals 1, then it will skip the rest of the code. So we are not going to see a log for test loop equal 1. Allow me to show you. As you can see, our loop actually skipped the first element of the array. Therefore, it skipped to give us a log of 1. As you can see, the log started with B, then CC, which in our case, the loop actually has been executed, but since our continue keyword exists in this code, allow me to give you another example. Now what's going to happen here, if our string, which is bb, is equal to the item which is exist here, then the condition is true, so we will get into the continue keyword, which will lead that we will skip the second element of the array. Allow me to show you. As you can see here, our first element of the array has been get a log. We have 1 and AA, but as we can see, the second element has been skipped, which is lead that the debug.log code has not been executed. Now, of course, the break and continue keywords work for all loops, whether it's for, do while, and while. Now, there is something very, very important that you need to know. I'll give you an example of now. In your code, you must never ever get into an infinite loop. You must avoid having an infinite loop in your code in any way possible. Allow me to give you an example of having an infinite loop which will consist of a simple block of code. What's going to happen? Now what's going to happen here, we have our integer which is equals 0. Our while loop check if the integer is lower than 5, then it will execute the block of code. As you can see, our test loop integer is not incrementing anywhere in this loop, meaning it will stay at 0, its value will stay 0, it will not be increased. That means that it will still be lower than 5. That means that this loop is going to proceed and execute, and it will keep executing each time, meaning this is an infinite loop. This loop is not incrementing to be higher or equal 5, and our while loop will keep executing since it's lower than 5. This simple line of code could actually break your game or the engine you are using. Allow me to show you. Now as you can see, the Unity editor is not actually starting. The Unity editor actually got stuck in that infinite loop. This is what an infinite loop can be. Avoid an infinite loop because it could break your game, and in my case, it actually crashes the engine. And the only way to get out of the engine is, as you can see, the loop actually consumes my resources. Well, this is the only way if you need to get out of the infinite loop. Need to say never do this. If you want to test it yourself, then you can expect a crash or even your whole machine will stop. I hope you enjoyed this video and would like to see you next time.